Welcome to Dark Testimony.
I still remember the first night it happened, though I've tried to forget. Alaska doesn't forgive mistakes. And the sea, well, the sea has its own kind of cruelty. I was hauling nets off the Bering Strait, the wind clawing at my jacket and the waves pounding the hull, when I felt it, a resistance heavier than any salmon or cod I'd ever pulled. My hands burned as I tugged, the rope vibrating like it had a pulse of its own.
I thought at first it was just a snag, a stray log or some tangled kelp. But the water churned below in a way that made my stomach tighten, like something alive was thrashing just beneath the surface. I shouted to my deckhand, a kid named Rick who hadn't seen his 20th birthday yet. He squinted against the spray. "What is it, boss?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. You learn in this job that saying something aloud sometimes makes it real. Instead, I kept pulling, the deck tilting, the ropes cutting into my palms. And then I saw it. The net broke the surface, and something glistened in the pale moonlight. Not a fish, not even close. Its shape was wrong in a way that made me step back, slip on the wet deck, and curse a blue streak that echoed across the water. Rick froze too, his face going pale under the cap of his hoodie. "Boss!" "What?" His voice trembled.
I wanted to tell him to pull it back down, forget it ever happened, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. There was a smell, first faint, like rotten seaweed, then sharp, metallic, like blood and iron mingled with something else I couldn't name. The net wobbled, and the thing inside it pulsed, as if testing the air, or us. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was some kind of mutant fish, something blown off course by currents. I'd seen weird things before, dressed in carcasses and strange jellyfish that glowed faintly in the dark. But this was different. Its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, caught the moonlight and seemed to study me. I swallowed hard. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant gulls. But there was something else underneath, a low, wet groan that I thought was coming from the hull, until I realized it was coming from the net itself. Rick stepped back, tripping over a coil of rope. It's alive!" he yelled. My stomach sank. I should have shouted at him to calm down, to focus, but my voice caught in my throat. I reached out, hesitant, to prod the net with a gaff hook, and the thing inside recoiled violently, thrashing like a nightmare of fins and fingers, snapping ropes, spraying seawater across the deck. I stumbled back, heart hammering,
And that's when I noticed something different, impossible. The claws, sharp, long, and uneven, covered in slimy scales. Nothing like anything I'd ever seen, but oddly humanoid. And the eyes, black, reflective, intelligent, locked onto mine. I could feel it watching me, sizing me up. My first instinct was to throw the net back into the sea, but it lashed out with a force that threw me sideways, scraping my ribs against the steel railing. I tasted salt and copper in my mouth, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the gaff hook. The storm wasn't helping. Rain hammered the deck in sheets, wind screaming through the rigging. Everything smelled of wet iron and sea rot. Rick was shouting again, but I couldn't hear him over the thrashing, over the pulse of fear running through me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the net went limp. Silence fell, heavy, pressing down on us. I stared at the water, trying to make sense of the thing I'd seen. It wasn't dead, I was sure of that. But the surface of the sea was calm again, smooth, mocking. Rick's voice cut through the quiet. "Did it go back down?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't want to admit I wasn't sure. And then I noticed the first clue that made my stomach drop even further. The net was lighter. Too light. Whatever had been in it had vanished, leaving only water and a faint smell of iron. My hands trembled, but something else caught my eye. A shadow moving beneath the waves, slow, deliberate, circling the boat. I thought I'd imagined it, tried to convince myself it was a trick of moonlight, but then I felt the tug again, not at the net, but at the hull. The boat shuddered, tiny but deliberate, as if something beneath the water was testing our strength. Rick stumbled again, his flashlight flickering, and the beam caught a glimpse of movement. Something huge, scaled, with an arm-like fin, retreating into the depths. I wanted to run, to shove him overboard, if it meant saving him. But my legs felt nailed to the deck. That was when I first realized something worse than the thing in the net. The sea itself was no longer predictable. Currents shifted under me, tides felt wrong, and the wind carried whispers I couldn't place, almost like voices echoing off invisible cliffs beneath the waves. I tried to steady my breathing, to tell myself it was exhaustion, paranoia, the isolation of the Bering Strait. But I knew better. There was intelligence down there, something calculating, patient, waiting for the next hole. By the time dawn started bleeding into the sky, the storm had eased, leaving a ghostly calm. Rick and I didn't speak much. We worked in silence, nets dragging heavier than they should, each pull a reminder that whatever lived
in those waters had tested us, and we'd barely survived. I stared into the grey horizon and knew one thing for certain. Fishing in Alaska was dangerous enough, but nothing in my years had prepared me for this. Whatever I'd hauled up that night wasn't a mistake of nature. It was something else, something older than the sea. And it wasn't done with me yet. And I had a sinking feeling that the next time the nets came up, it would fight back harder. I kept thinking that maybe the first night was a fluke, a strange confluence of wind, tide, and bad luck. But I knew better, and deep down, Rick probably did too. The morning fog hugged the water like a living thing, curling around the boat in cold, damp fingers, and every time I glanced over the side, I swore I saw ripples that didn't belong to the waves. The nets felt heavier than they should, dragging against the current with a sluggish, deliberate weight. Final. Every haul that morning made my knuckles white and my spine ache. And the memory of the claws, the ones that had reached out at me, was burned into my mind. By the third pull, I was already sweating under my gear. The nets came up slowly, groaning, wet and sticky, and I noticed something strange at the edges. Scraps of flesh, pale and slimy, tangled in the mesh. Not fish, not seal, not anything I could put a name to. I gagged, leaning over the railing to spit out the bitter taste of fear that coated my tongue. Rick didn't flinch, though his face was tight, pale, almost like he was holding back panic. I should have shouted at him to drop the net, call it a day, head back to port. But that's not how this work goes. You never leave a net in the water. And I had a feeling that if I did, whatever was down there would notice. The next tug was different. It jerked violently, almost like the thing below was mocking me, letting the ropes slide through its fingers. I caught the edge of the net just in time to keep it from snapping. A foul, coppery smell hit me so hard it made my eyes water. My stomach rolled, and I heard Rick muttering prayers under his breath. I didn't blame him. I wanted to mutter prayers too, but the words stuck in my throat. I could hear the creak of the hull, the slap of waves against steel, and beneath it all, something deeper, something patient and deliberate, shifting under the boat. staring at the water, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the claws, the eyes, the way the thing had studied me. But then I saw it, a shadow, just a movement, gliding under the fog, like it had no right to exist. Its shape was wrong, elongated, grotesque in a way that
made my stomach knot. My fingers tightened around the rope. "Rick," I whispered, and his head snapped up, eyes wide. I pointed toward the shadow. For a moment, it was just a vague blur. Then it struck. A shape breaking the surface, a hand-like fin slapping the water before vanishing again. We didn't speak after that. Not really. Our motions became mechanical. Each pull of the net, another reminder that whatever lurked below was aware of us. And then I noticed it. Something I still can't explain. Every time I looked away, just for a second, the net shifted slightly, as if it had been repositioned by an unseen hand. I thought I was going mad. Maybe the cold, the endless night, the isolation of the Bering Strait was eating at me. But Rick saw it too. I caught him staring at the net when he thought I wasn't looking, eyes wide with the same terror I felt. Around noon, the fog thinned a little, and the sun, weak and pale, cast a silver sheen on the water. I could see the nets more clearly now, and my stomach sank. One of the holes revealed shapes that made my knees buckle. Fins twisted and broken, eyes staring blankly, unblinking, and something else. Fingers, arms, parts of creatures that couldn't exist in any ecosystem I knew. I gagged, retching over the side while Rick cursed under his breath. We hauled in what we could, but every pull revealed more of the impossible. And beneath it all, I felt the tugging, subtle but unrelenting, like the sea itself was alive, testing our resolve. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the unease had crept under my skin. Shadows in the water stretched longer than they should, and the wind carried sounds that didn't belong to gulls or the waves. A low, wet slapping, like something swimming just beneath. The hull punctuated the roar of the tide. Rick was jittery, tapping the railing, muttering that he wanted to go back, but I couldn't. Something in me knew we couldn't stop. The next haul would tell us too much and too little, and I could already feel the way the unknown was pressing down, clawing at our attention. The next catch was wrong in a new way. The net came up almost empty, save for a single slick mass that pulsed as we lifted it. I froze, a low, guttural whisper. carried on the wind and in the slap of waves against the hull. I wanted to convince myself it was the sea or my own imagination, but the voice said something. I couldn't make out words, not fully, but it carried urgency, malice, curiosity. I jerked the net back as though afraid it would pull something else through the surface, something we weren't ready to face. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the ropes. And every instinct screamed at me to cut them loose and run. But I didn't. By evening, the fog had returned, thick, clinging, swallowing the horizon. The sun dipped below the grey line of the water, leaving the boat in shadow. I noticed small things, tiny details that set my nerves on edge. A rope that had been coiled neatly, now twisted and damp. The glint of something under the deck that I couldn't identify. The low vibration of the boat, almost like a heartbeat. Rick didn't talk. He barely moved. We worked in silence, our minds circling the same question. What the hell was down there? And more importantly, how many nights would it take before it decided we weren't just observers anymore? The last pull of the day was the worst. The net dragged like it was being pulled by 1,000 hands, and when it finally broke the surface, I saw something that made my chest tighten, my throat dry. It was a partial figure, humanoid, but wrong. Limbs elongated, skin mottled, hairless, with eyes that glimmered faintly like wet stones. And when it twisted toward me, just enough to reveal its face, I knew the fishing in Alaska had changed forever. Whatever lived beneath the surface, it was waiting, and it was learning. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin was small, the heater sputtering and coughing like it wanted to die, and every groan of the boat made me flinch. Rick had passed out on the bench, exhausted, but I stayed awake, staring at the windows into the fog-thick night. Outside, the wind tugged at the rigging, making the lines sing in eerie, high-pitched tones. I kept thinking about the last haul, the thing in the net, and how its eyes had followed me. They weren't just watching, I realized. They were calculating, planning. I tried to distract myself, checked the gauges, sorted ropes, anything to keep my hands busy, but the memory kept clawing back. I could still feel the cold, slick weight of that partial figure, the unnatural twist of its limbs, and the whispers. God, the whispers. I told myself it was the wind, that I'd imagined it, but every time I leaned over the side, I thought I heard voices beneath the water, soft and curious, speaking in a language I almost recognized, but couldn't quite grasp. I shook my head and cursed. Sleep would come eventually. It had to. Morning brought more of the same grey fog, dense and almost sentient, clinging to the boat as though it had a hold on us. The nets felt heavier, thicker with something I couldn't name. And even the water smelled different, metallic, decaying, and something else I couldn't place. Every pull brought more fragments, more unidentifiable bits of flesh, fins, limbs, and eyes staring blankly into nothing. The sea was becoming a graveyard, and I could feel its attention shifting from mere curiosity to deliberate menace. Rick moved slower, glancing at the edges of the net with suspicion, his eyes darting to the fog as if expecting it to attack. It was around mid-morning when the first true anomaly appeared. I was hauling a net when it jolted violently, harder than anything I'd felt before. My hands slipped, rope cutting into my palms, and I stumbled back, heart hammering. Something wet and heavy hit the deck, slapping against the steel with a sickening, gelatinous thud. I froze. It was long, serpentine, scaled, and I swear it looked straight at me. Not with animal instinct, but something else, something aware. Its body convulsed, stretching and twisting in ways no creature should, trying to escape the net. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising as I realized how close it had been to breaking free. Rick shouted something I didn't catch, and I grabbed him by the shoulder. "Don't look away. Don't ever look away," I hissed, though I wasn't sure why. My voice sounded foreign, even to me, harsh and desperate. I tugged the net back, sweating, shivering, and finally got it over the railing. But when it landed, it didn't stay still. Limbs, fins, claws, whatever they were, scrabbled against the deck, leaving streaks of slime. I stepped back, tripping over a coil of rope, and my hands burned as I rubbed the cuts. The thing's eyes followed me, black and glossy, and I could almost hear its thoughts. Curious, afraid, interesting. And then it spoke, not in words I could understand, but in vibrations through the deck, like the boat itself had been possessed. I felt it in my chest, low and thrumming. I wanted to scream but couldn't. Rick was frozen, wide-eyed, and I realized neither of us had any idea what to do next. The creature's body pulsed, rippling under the net, and when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tiny scratches along the ropes, deliberate and methodical, almost like it was marking its territory or testing our strength. The day dragged on, every haul worse than the last. Each time I thought we'd seen the worst, the sea reminded us there was more. Always more. Shadows under the water lengthened unnaturally, and the currents seemed to shift with intent, tugging at the boat, teasing the nets. I caught glimpses of shapes moving just beneath the surface, but the fog always swallowed them before I could identify anything. And sometimes, just sometimes, I could swear I heard footsteps on deck when no one was there. Tiny, wet splashes following me wherever I moved. Rick finally broke the silence in a low, trembling voice. "Boss, it's learning us, isn't it?" His words hung in the foggy air like a curse. I didn't answer because I knew he was right. This wasn't random. Every struggle, every pull, every thud and slither. It was a test, and the thing beneath us was adapting. The more it fought, the more it seemed to understand how to manipulate the nets, the currents, the boat itself. By late afternoon, exhaustion had us both on edge. I noticed my hands were shaking constantly, cuts from the ropes stinging in rhythm with my heartbeat. The fog thickened again, a suffocating wall around us, and I realized I hadn't seen land for hours. Not that it mattered. The horizon was just a grey smear, endless and oppressive, and the whispers returned, closer this time, weaving in with the creak of the hull and the slap of waves, almost forming syllables I could almost recognize. They weren't words, not really, but they carried intent. They were studying us, taunting us. The last haul of the day almost broke me. The net came up slower than anything I'd ever felt, heavy with a mass that pulsed against the ropes, thrashing with a sick, deliberate intelligence. And when it broke the surface, I saw the face, or what I assumed was a face, glimmering in the grey light, eyes black and glossy, twisted in shape, but unmistakably sentient. And then, just for a moment, it smiled, not humanly, not like a predator, but in a way that promised malice, cunning, and inevitability. I felt the deck tilt beneath me as the wind howled, and I realized something I'd been trying to avoid. This wasn't a creature we could outrun. By the time the sun dipped below the fogged horizon, leaving a dim twilight that made the boat seem almost unreal, Rick and I were silent. We worked mechanically, pulling nets with trembling hands, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement, every whisper that might signal the thing beneath had returned. I realized then that the sea had changed. The Bering Strait, once predictable in its violence, had become something alive, aware, and patient. It wasn't just a nightmare in my mind. It was real, tangible, and waiting. and as the fog thickened around us, curling like fingers over the railing, I knew with a sinking certainty that the thing below wasn't just learning, it was hunting. By the fourth day, I wasn't sure if I was awake or trapped in some fevered hallucination. The fog never lifted, and the sea itself felt alive, moving with intent. Every tug of the nets carried a weight that seemed unnatural, as if the thing below could sense hesitation and respond to it. Rick moved silently, pale, shoulders tense, eyes darting to every shadow. I kept telling myself it was fear, that it was exhaustion, but my gut told me otherwise. Something intelligent was down there, watching, learning, waiting. The first real encounter came just before noon. We were hauling a net that felt heavier than any we'd pulled so far. My hands were raw, knuckles bleeding, and the ropes seemed almost to vibrate in my grip. Something thrashed inside, and for the first time, I could hear distinct movements. Fingers, claws, scraping against the metal mesh. I shouted at Rick to hold it steady, but his eyes were wide with terror. The net broke the surface, and what came out, I can't describe it fully without sounding insane. It was massive, far larger than anything that should live in these waters. Its skin was mottled, grey-green and slick, stretching over limbs that bent in impossible directions. Fingers elongated into jagged claws, knuckles scraping against the deck as it thrashed. Its face, if you could call it that, twisted toward me, eyes black, wet, intelligent, and for a moment it paused. I felt it studying me, testing my fear. And that pause lasted longer than it should have. The creature's body writhed, almost serpentine in motion, and I could see the muscles and sinew moving with horrifying intelligence. Then it tried again, and this time it managed to free part of itself. One arm, or something resembling an arm, flailed toward us, wet and slimy, fingertips scraping metal with a sound that made my teeth rattle. I swung the gaff hook instinctively, hitting it hard against its limb. There was a wet crack, a scream that was more sound than sound, echoing off the water and into the fog. It recoiled, but not for long. Its eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, unyielding. I realized then that the thing wasn't just dangerous, it was aware. It knew what we feared, and it was using it. Every flinch, every gasp, every movement we made only encouraged it. The fog seemed to close in around us, damp and suffocating, carrying whispers I could almost understand. Words, names, I don't know. I only know that every syllable carried intent. Rick was shaking, muttering prayers, staring at the net as if expecting it to rise again and strike.
I could feel sweat dripping down my spine, cold and sticky, the taste of salt and fear thick in my mouth. And still, the creature pressed, testing us, probing, alive with a cunning that no animal should possess. It struck again. This time, it wrapped part of itself around the net, thrashing with impossible strength. The boat rocked violently, metal scraping, wood groaning. I held on with everything I had, but it was like fighting a force of nature, an intelligent, malevolent current that wanted nothing more than to drag us under. Rick screamed, and I grabbed him, trying to pull him away from the edge. The water churned beneath us, and for the first time, I realized that the creature was not just in the net. It was in the water too, moving under the hull, around the propeller, testing every inch of our defenses. Then I heard it clearly, a voice, low and guttural, coming from somewhere beneath the deck. It wasn't words I recognized, but it carried meaning, anger, curiosity. It was calling to us, challenging us, and I felt my stomach turn at the implication. And then I understood. The sea wasn't just home to this thing. The boat, the nets, us. It was all part of its domain. I swung the gaff again, catching the thing mid-thrash. It shrieked, a sound that made my blood run cold. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the rope, and every instinct screamed at me to cut the net, to let it sink, to run. But I didn't. Something primal kept me there, staring into those black eyes that reflected the foggy sky, calculating, waiting. And I knew somehow that if I let go, it would come back, harder, smarter, hungrier. By the time it finally retreated, slipping back into the depths with a wet slap that echoed across the deck, I was shaking from head to toe. Rick was huddled in the corner, silent, eyes wide and unblinking. The nets were shredded, useless, but we both knew it wasn't the damage that mattered. The encounter had changed us. The sea had changed us. And most of all, the thing had marked us. I remember standing there, staring out over the grey, endless water, feeling the fog press in like fingers against my chest. I wanted to believe it was a single creature, a one-time nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever lived down there was ancient, patient, and cunning, and it wasn't finished with us. That night, when the heater coughed out its last sputter and the fog wrapped the boat in its suffocating embrace, I lay awake, listening to the creak of the wood, the slap of water, and the whispers I could almost understand.
Rick
had tried to sleep, but I knew he was listening too, waiting for the next strike, the next pull, the next impossible thing that would emerge from the nets. And I realized something I hadn't admitted even to myself. We weren't just fishing anymore. We were prey. The first real confrontation had taught me that much. The creature wasn't just a monster. It was intelligent, relentless, and growing bolder with every encounter. And I could feel it, down there, in the grey depths, calculating the next move, learning our patterns, testing our fear. I knew then that nothing would ever prepare us for what came next. The sea had opened its door to something unnatural, and it had chosen us to witness it firsthand. By the 5th day, everything felt off. The fog had thickened to the point that I couldn't see past the bow of the boat, and the horizon was gone, swallowed by a grey nothingness. The nets, frayed and mangled from the previous encounter, were still in the water, weighted down with whatever had slipped through. I couldn't bring myself to check them. Not fully, but I felt the pull, subtle at first, then strong, testing our strength, reminding me that it was still down there. Rick hadn't spoken in hours, and when he did, it was only whispers, muttered prayers against whatever we were facing. The day started like the others. Fog thick, sea uneasy. I went to pull the net and froze instantly. The water around it was boiling, bubbling unnaturally, like something enormous was thrashing below. The ropes were taut, stretching like elastic, pulling with deliberate, almost playful force. I could feel every wave, every surge through the deck, vibrating into my chest, a low, wet hum that seemed to carry intention. Something beneath us was communicating, mocking us even. And I realized my own fear was a signal, a cue for it to act. When the net finally broke the surface, I nearly stumbled backward. It wasn't one figure this time. Parts of multiple creatures tangled together, limbs interwoven in grotesque configurations, pulsing, writhing, scraping against the deck. Fins and claws, pale and mottled, scraped the steel. Eyes blinked in patterns, some intelligent, some blank, some calculating. I gagged. The smell of wet iron and decay, so sharp, it made my stomach twist. Rick dropped to his knees, staring in horror, muttering, "What the hell? What the hell is that?" And then I heard it. Not whispers, but a sound so deep and guttural. I felt it in my teeth. Something massive had moved beneath the hull, unseen but palpably present, and the deck shuddered under our feet. I grabbed Rick's shoulder, trying to keep him steady, but the boat tilted, water slapping over the side. The creatures in the net writhed violently, as if aware of the presence below, responding to it, and I realized with horror that whatever was down there wasn't just hunting, it was orchestrating. I swung the gaff hook desperately, striking a limb, hearing a sickening snap, feeling the recoil vibrate through my arms.
One of the creatures looked directly at me, and I could swear it smiled, not humanly, not like an animal, but knowingly, maliciously, as though it recognized me. I stumbled back, slipping in the slime on deck, and the world seemed to tilt. For a terrifying second, I considered jumping into the water, letting the thing drag me down, just to escape the deck where it could reach us. The fog pressed closer, cold and wet against my skin. Stop. Every shadow seemed alive, moving, reaching. Rick was pale, silent, except for quiet prayers. And beneath us, I could hear the low, wet thrum of movement, of intelligence, the sound of a predator learning, testing, expanding its reach. The sea had become a cage, and we were inside. I wanted to scream, to throw the net back and run, but my instincts told me that would only provoke it. Then it struck again. From the water, a massive arm-like limb shot upward, wet and slick, claws scraping metal, with a sound that made my chest seize. The net ripped, creatures tumbling across the deck in a mass of writhing limbs, and I fought to keep them contained. One brushed against my leg, cold, slimy, and I almost screamed. Its eyes, black, glistening, met mine, and I felt the weight of recognition, of intent. It was learning me. Rick, the boat, every weakness, every hesitation. The hours dragged into a nightmare rhythm. Every pull of the net, every creak of the deck, every murmur in the fog carried tension, carrying curiosity loops I couldn't ignore. Shadows moving beneath us, slivers of impossible anatomy, whispers just beyond comprehension. I caught glimpses of shapes circling the boat, faint reflections in the water that twisted unnaturally, following us, testing us. And then the water erupted beside the hull. Massive forms leaping and diving back beneath, their movement too coordinated, too intelligent for anything natural. By evening, exhaustion had dulled our reflexes, but sharpened our terror. Rick refused to touch the net anymore, just standing frozen at the railing, eyes wide, mouth dry, silent except for shallow breaths. I could feel the creatures observing, learning, enjoying the fear we radiated. I realized with growing horror that this was no longer about survival or fishing. It was a game, one we were losing without even understanding the rules. And then the most terrifying moment came. The fog parted just slightly, and I saw something in the water, enormous and impossibly dark, its shape indistinct, like a shadow given mass. It moved beneath the boat with deliberate precision, circling, measuring, waiting. I wanted to call Rick's attention to it, but he was paralyzed by fear. I couldn't look away either. The thing under the water knew we were watching. I could feel it. It wanted us to see it, wanted us to acknowledge its presence. And worse, I felt something else. A tug, subtle but insistent, on the very deck, as though it could pull the boat under if it chose. By the time night returned, the fog thickened again, wrapping us in an oppressive, suffocating embrace. We sat in silence, listening to the slap of water against the hull, the creak of the boat, and the subtle, rhythmic pulsing beneath our feet. Rick refused to speak. I kept my eyes on the horizon that didn't exist, feeling the weight of intelligence pressing up through the water, through the nets, through the air itself. Every sensory detail screamed at me. The sea was no longer a place of work, of livelihood, of survival. It was alive, aware, and it had claimed us as part of its domain. I couldn't stop thinking about the next haul. I knew it would be worse, smarter, bolder. I could feel it already, rippling through the water, coiling, preparing, and deep down, I realized that the creature, whatever it truly was evolving, learning from every interaction, every strike, every fear we projected. The nets were no longer tools. They were bait.
And we were the catch. By the 6th day, I was convinced we'd never leave that stretch of water alive. The fog never lifted, and the Bering Strait had become a grey, endless trap. Every sense I had was on edge. The slap of waves against the hull, the low vibration under our feet, the faint metallic tang in the air that hinted at something dead, or worse, something unnatural. Rick was barely coherent, moving in jerky, robotic motions, eyes wide,
and unblinking, muttering prayers I didn't recognize. I didn't blame him. I barely recognized myself. The nets, frayed and mangled, still hung in the water, and every pull felt deliberate, heavier than before, like the thing beneath was learning our strength, learning our limits. It wasn't just a creature, it was an intelligence, and I could feel it sizing us up, cataloging every reaction, every hesitation. I'd tried to rationalize it as a series of freak occurrences, mutations, maybe an unknown species, but my gut told me otherwise. This was something older, something patient, something that had learned to wait until fear made its prey predictable. Mid-morning, the tug on the net was violent, sudden, and almost taunting. I grabbed the rope, heart hammering, and felt something massive thrashing below. I peered over the side, and for the first time, I saw the outline of something that was clearly watching us. Something that wasn't fully in the water, not fully of the world we knew. Its head rose, elongated and mottled, fins scraping the fog like wings, and it fixed its gaze on me. I froze, feeling as if it was peering straight into my chest, reading my heartbeat, my thoughts, my fear. Rick gasped behind me, and I realized he'd been staring too. The thing's intelligence was undeniable now. It was no mindless predator. It was something older, something that had adapted over centuries, something that knew. And then, impossibly, it tilted its head, the water sliding off jagged ridges that could almost be called teeth, and I felt something like recognition, like it knew us, our routines, our weaknesses. When I pulled the net aboard, the horror waiting on deck was beyond anything I'd expected.
It wasn't a single creature this time. Parts of multiple entities had somehow intertwined, forming a writhing, pulsing mass that seemed to anticipate every motion of the ropes, of our hands, of the deck itself. Fins, claws, spindly limbs, and eyes in impossible places, some black, some glossy, some empty, gazed at us. And then the thing moved as one, wriggling and curling, its mass reshaping with a terrifying intelligence. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook so violently I barely held the gaff. Rick was crouched, silent, staring at the writhing mass, as if any sudden movement might provoke it. And that's when I noticed the first truly chilling detail. Tiny scratches on the deck. Not random, not from the ropes or the nets. They were deliberate, like markings, and they led to the edge of the hull, where the water was dark and infinite. Someone or something was mapping the boat, mapping us. The whispers returned, but this time they were unmistakable. Low, guttural, threading through the fog and over the water, carrying a rhythm that almost felt like language. Not words I could translate,
but intent, malice, curiosity, hunger, and beneath it all, I could feel the deck pulse, vibrating like a heartbeat in response, as if the thing beneath the water and the deck itself were connected, communicating. Then I understood. It wasn't just the net, not just the creatures tangled in it. The water, the fog, the boat itself, everything was part of its domain. It wasn't just hunting, it was studying, adapting, preparing. And every time we thought we'd seen its worst, it revealed another layer, another piece of its intelligence, another way to unsettle us. Mid-afternoon brought something I hadn't anticipated. Movement inside the cabin. I turned, thinking it was Rick, but he was frozen at the railing, eyes wide, silent. The door creaked, slowly, deliberately. I hesitated, heart hammering, and then I saw it. Not fully, not yet, but a shape, a shadow, flickered across the wall, elongated, unnatural. My stomach dropped, and I realized with a cold certainty, it could leave the water. It could reach us anywhere. Panic rose, but I forced it down. I grabbed the gaff, my hands raw, shaking, and I tried to think. The net, maybe it hadn't finished with us. I ran to the railing, peering over the side, and there it was again, a shadow beneath the water, circling, moving with intent. I could see the ripple of something massive, stretching and coiling in impossible ways, watching, waiting for me to react. My stomach lurched, bile rising, as I realized how small we were, how helpless, and how thoroughly. The Bering Strait had become its hunting ground. Rick whispered, barely audible, It's smart, boss. Too smart. And he was right. Every instinct screamed at me to cut the nets, abandon ship, run for shore. But I knew better. Whatever it was, it wanted us alive for now. It wanted our fear. And as the fog closed in tighter, curling around the boat like living fingers, I understood that we were already part of its domain. There was no escape, not yet. That evening, I sat against the cabin wall, gaff hook in hand, staring at the water, the fog, and the faint, dark horizon. The creatures in the nets were silent for the moment, but I knew better. Silence wasn't peace, it was anticipation. And beneath the deck, I could feel the vibration, the pulse of something massive, aware, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me that the real revelation was yet to come. I had a sinking certainty that the next encounter wouldn't just be another struggle. It would be a revelation, one that would show me exactly what the thing beneath the Bering Strait was, and why it had chosen us. And for the first time, I wondered if either of us would survive to tell the tale. By the 7th day, I couldn't tell if time still existed. The fog had grown almost tactile, pressing against our faces, wrapping around the boat like some living thing. The Bering Strait wasn't just a place anymore. It was a labyrinth of grey, a prison without walls. Every creak of the deck, every slap of water against the hull carried intent. The nets had been shredded to useless strings, but I could feel the pull, subtle under the boat, and I knew it wasn't done testing us. Rick hadn't spoken since dawn. His eyes were hollow, vacant, staring at the water as if expecting it to rise and take him. I tried to reach him, but he flinched, recoiling as though my touch was poison. The fog was thick, blinding, and I could hear whispers threading through it, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They weren't words anymore. They were impressions, feelings, commands. My chest tightened every time I tried to breathe, as though the air itself carried the thing's will. The next pull of the net brought a revelation that I'll never forget. That water boiled around it, thrashing violently, and I realized with horror that the creatures had fused, not just tangling together, but merging into something larger, something coherent, something that could move with precision. Limbs that shouldn't exist, bent and stretched, forming functional appendages that pulled against the deck. Eyes dotted the mass like wet stones, all focused, all aware. And then I saw the face, or what resembled a face, emerge, glistening with a wet intelligence that made my knees buckle. It stared at me. I swear it recognized me. Not like a predator recognizes prey. This was more deliberate, as if it had catalogued every fear, every hesitation, every twitch of muscle over the past 6 days. And then it spoke. Not in words I could comprehend, but in vibrations that traveled through the boat, rattling my teeth, thrumming in my chest. It wasn't a sound I could ignore. I felt it in my bones, understood it, and it made my hair stand on end. It wanted something. Rick screamed then, breaking the trance, and the creature's mass jerked violently, thrashing against the ropes, testing its limits, showing us the scope of its strength. I grabbed a gaff hook and struck blindly, hearing the wet snap of its appendage. But it recoiled, not in pain, but in amusement, and I realized my strikes had been anticipated. Every movement we'd made had been studied, every reaction predicted. I felt my stomach drop. We weren't just prey, we were an experiment. And then the water around the boat parted slightly, and I saw more of it, larger than I could imagine. the outline barely visible through the fog. Its form was shifting, liquid yet solid, and it moved with intent, circling the hull. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just the mass in the net. The net, the water, the fog, the deck, even the boat itself. It was all part of the entity. It wasn't hunting us like animals. It was showing us what it could do, how it could manipulate, how thoroughly it had claimed this stretch of the sea. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped sharply. The fog clung to us, damp and suffocating, and the vibrations beneath the deck had grown stronger, almost like a heartbeat. I realized the creature could reach us anywhere, over the railing, through the deck, even into the cabin. My mind raced. Every instinct screamed to abandon ship, to dive into the freezing, treacherous water and hope for survival. But I knew better. The creature would adapt, learn, and hunt us wherever we went. The sea wasn't just its home. We were trapped in its domain. Then came the most horrifying discovery. As I leaned over the railing, peering into the grey depths, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Markings on the hull. Not scratches from ropes or claws, but symbols. Deliberate, precise, almost geometric. It had etched them into the metal somehow, beneath the spray and slime. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the cold, wet grooves, and realized with terror that these were a form of communication. Not for us, not for the world, but for something beneath the waves, something vast and ancient. The thing was intelligent, older than any fish, older than any legend I'd heard, and it had been patient. Rick whispered something I barely caught. It's teaching us. The words hung in the foggy night like a curse, and I knew he was right. The creature wasn't just attacking. It was instructing, manipulating, bending us into its design. Every pull, every thrash, every vibration through the deck was a lesson, a test, and every failure brought us closer to something else, something I couldn't yet comprehend. Then, impossibly, the fog parted in a narrow strip along the horizon. I saw movement, massive, undulating, stretching far beyond the boat. My stomach dropped. The thing wasn't confined to the net, not confined to this area of the water. Its influence reached far, connected through the fog, the currents, the very air around us. And as I stared, paralyzed, I felt its awareness lock onto me again, studying me, learning me, understanding exactly how to break me without touching me physically. The night deepened, and with it, the intensity of its presence. I could hear the water pulsing, the deck vibrating in rhythm with the unseen heartbeat beneath us.
The whispers were everywhere now, threading into my mind, teasing me, promising revelation and terror in the same breath. Rick shivered beside me, silent, trembling, and I knew he was realizing the same thing I was. Whatever we faced, whatever had claimed this stretch of sea, was beyond comprehension. It wasn't a creature we could fight. It wasn't even a predator in any traditional sense. It was something else. Something ancient, something patient. By the end of the night, I understood one undeniable truth. The Bering Strait had chosen us. The fog, the water, the creatures, the deck itself. They weren't just threats. They were the body of something vast, something alive, something that had been waiting for centuries. And we were part of its lesson. By the 8th day, I could barely distinguish between sea, fog, and nightmare. The Bering Strait had become a grey, living cage, and every sound, the slap of waves, the creak of the deck, the whispers threading through the fog, carried intent. Rick and I were skeletal shadows of ourselves, hands raw, bodies exhausted, minds fraying under the constant, intelligent pressure of the things beneath. I knew then that there would be no ordinary escape. This wasn't a fishing trip. It had never been about fish. It had been about us. The final pull came just before the last pale light of the sun disappeared behind the fog. The net tore violently against the water, heavier than anything I had ever felt. I gripped the rope with every ounce of strength I had left. Knees trembling, vision narrowing, moving with deliberate intelligence. Eyes everywhere, black and glistening, fixed on me. And for the first time, I saw its mouth, or what I assumed was a mouth, curve in something like a smile, deliberate and mocking. Swung the gaff hook blindly, striking limbs that weren't there a moment before, feeling the wet impact vibrate up my arms. It shrieked, not in pain, but in triumph. I realized with a sick clarity, it wasn't afraid of us. It never had been. The boat pitched violently. Waves slapped over the deck. I stumbled, fell against the railing, heart hammering, and caught sight of Rick, pale, frozen, staring into the writhing mass, silent. The creature pulsed with intelligence, bending water, fog, and deck into a single, coordinated force. I could feel the vibration beneath my feet, the boat thrumming in rhythm with its heartbeat. And then, impossibly, it spoke. Not words, but a pressure, a communication through bone, through sinew, through fear. It wanted acknowledgement, recognition, submission. I tried to pull the net over the side to rid the deck of its thrashing, but it was too late.
Limbs lashed, claws scraped. Water sprayed over us in cold, suffocating sheets. I felt the gaff slip from my hands. Rick's scream was cut short as a mass slammed against him. I lunged, grabbed his arm, dragged him back toward the cabin, but the thing was everywhere.
Living nightmare.
And then I remembered something. A small hope.
Desperate.
Foolish.
The lantern.
I grabbed it, shaking, fumbling with the metal handle, and swung it over the deck. The flame leapt against the fog, casting long, trembling shadows, illuminating parts of the creature. It recoiled. Not entirely, but enough. Its movements hesitated. It wasn't expecting fire, wasn't expecting light that could disrupt its presence. I seized the moment, dragging Rick toward the railing, toward the lifeboat we had barely maintained. The thing shrieked, pulsing, limbs lashing, but the fire held its attention. We slid into the lifeboat, water up to our knees, fog pressing in around us. The deck of the boat, now a writhing, partially empty horror, seemed to watch us leave, and I knew in that instant that the entity beneath had marked us. Its intelligence, its patience, its awareness, it would not forget. We were part of it now, catalogued, studied, prey that had temporarily escaped. We rode through the grey, through water that seemed almost alive, feeling every tug, every pull, every whisper of intention from beneath. I dared not look back. The thing followed, or at least I felt it. Every ripple in the water, every vibration of the oars, every sound in the fog, carrying its presence. We didn't speak. We didn't breathe more than necessary. Fear had reduced us to instinctual survival. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Then faintly, dimly, I saw land. Dark shapes emerged from the fog. Rocks, cliffs, the first tangible sign of solid ground in nearly a week. Relief surged, but it was fragile, cautious. Fog still pressed in, still whispered, still pulsed. We reached the shore, collapsed on rocks slick with moisture and decay, gasping for air that didn't carry its weight. And I dared a glance back. The water was calm again, grey and unremarkable. The boat floated empty, nets shredded, deck slick and silent. I should have felt relief. I should have believed we were safe. But deep in my chest, I felt the pulse still. The intelligence, the awareness, the malevolent patience. I could feel it lingering, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the water, in the
fog in the wind that carried the scent of iron and salt. Rick stayed huddled beside me, silent, and I finally spoke, voice hoarse, trembling. "It's not done with us," I whispered. He didn't answer. Neither of us needed to. We both knew. The sea had chosen us, and we had survived this time, but only barely, only temporarily. The intelligence that haunted the nets, the water, the fog, it would return.
Smarter, bolder, hungrier, and I realized with a sick clarity that it had already taught us exactly what it wanted us to learn. Fear is more binding than chains, and knowledge is more terrifying than death. I never went fishing again. Not in Alaska, not anywhere near open water. I avoided the coast, the rivers, the oceans. But sometimes, at night, when the wind presses cold against my window, when the rain taps against the glass, I swear I can hear it. The pulse of water, the whisper of fog, the faint echo of eyes watching me. And I know that it's still there, cataloging, learning, waiting for the next time it needs to test, to teach, to claim. And if you ever hear your name whispered from the dark, don't turn around, just run.